Very much still a big story, lots of different strands to this. What have you picked up on?
Well, let's start out with a cartoon in the International New York Times by a Shapat, where you can see, on the one hand, Ukrainians celebrating, waving a little European flag in the background there, but on the other side of the border in Russia, you can see President Vladimir Putin sitting on a gas pipeline there, saying, "I thought I was in command." So it suggests what a lot of critics call his energy blackmail. Well, it suggests that doesn't really work anymore.
Because they did switch off the gas to Ukraine in the past, didn't
That's
they?
absolutely right. And a lot of papers are also focusing on how Russia, but also the EU and the US are trying to deal with this whole crisis. There have been calls for dialogue among the uncertainty that's facing Ukraine. But I pulled out an alarming article in the Moscow Times by a political analyst named Gregory Boft. Now, he says that Ukraine is really entering a period of chaos. It's teetering on collapse, and in fact, it's a step away from war. So very alarming words there. Now, he says that European leaders really need to realize that Russia views a geopolitical threat or defeat rather, in Ukraine as an existential threat to Russia itself. He says that this is a threat to which they must respond with any means in their power, including military might. So quite an alarming article there.
Yeah, very strong words. Well, a man who's really at the centre of this story, but we haven't really been talking about, at least today, President Yanukovych. He's a wanted man, he's a missing man, and yeah, nobody really seems to know where he is.
That's right. So a lot of people are focusing on his character. I pulled an article out of The Guardian, which says that he was known for his thuggish behavior and his obsession with money. And according to this article, he actually took great pleasure in bragging to other heads of state about how corrupt he was. Now, this is according to Georgia's former president, Mikhail Saakashvili, who met Yanukovych on several occasions.
Not a fan of all things Russian.
That's
it must
right.
Be said,
it's important to note
Saakashvili.
he's not a big fan of Russia, but he says that Yanukovych would talk very loudly about how he had corrupted senior officials in the Supreme Court, in the Constitutional Court. To quote him, he says the guy didn't have any idea about morality. So do take that with a grain of salt, though, because this is coming from Saakashvili. Another interesting article about how Georgia is reacting to all this in the Wall Street Journal. This article points out that Georgia is another former Soviet republic that has, quote, been historically bullied around by Russia. Georgians are paying very close attention to what's happening in Ukraine because Georgia is set to sign a trade agreement very similar to the one that Ukraine was supposed to sign with the EU, and there are fears that they could face mounting pressure from the Kremlin.
OK, let's move away from Ukraine then to Italy, Italian politics. The Italian press reacting to the ambitious plans that the new Prime Minister Matteo Renzi has.
That's right. La Stampa says that he's very optimistic and he wants to move quickly, but can he deliver on all his ambitious economic reforms? This editorial, for instance, points out that speed and optimism are two virtues that can very quickly turn into weaknesses. Now, Il Giornale, which is important to note, is a conservative paper owned by Berlusconi's family, says that Renzi is off to a false start. Though he's new and fresh to face, he looks a lot like former leaders, and instead of a revolution, Italians can expect a lot more of the same.
OK, and the UK's Guardian newspaper has been looking at analysing how the Italian press is reacting.
That's right. It seems like they're more excited about the fact that his cabinet is gender balanced, but they're not so focused on the education and the smarts of these female ministers. According to this article, they're actually focusing on their appearance, their dress, their makeup, etc. So this article says that Italy still has a long way to go in terms of gender equality.
Right, OK, well, we're going to stay in that part of the world. An interesting statistic coming from the Vatican.
That's right. This really surprised me. The Vatican City drinks more wine per person than any country in the world.
Well, they're probably having communion wine every day.
They are having communion wine. There's not only the communion wine, but it's also the fact that the Vatican's population is rather unusual. Well, it's rather uniform, rather. It's a lot of old men that are highly educated and tend to eat in large groups, and all these are factors that can contribute to greater wine consumption. But this is according to the latest statistics that are released in Wine Institute. It was interesting to note is that the Holy See consumes 74 liters of wine on average. That's about 105 bottles of wine over a year. That's double the amount of wine that's drunk by an average person in France and in Italy. And according to this article, it's great news for the Vatican's only supermarket that provides all the wine to all those very thirsty priests.
Excellent. Well, French wine exporters need to get on that, probably. Don't know, a good market for them there. Thanks very much, Florence Villemino, with the International News Roundup. We're going to take a short break now, but coming up here on Live from Paris, plenty more on our top international news stories, including a special report from Spain after Europe defied strong opposition to approve a new type of genetically modified supercorn that's got environmentalists worried. Stay with us.
Reporters.
Relaunch of nuclear talks, release of some political prisoners, reopening of the House of Cinema. Since his election, President Rouhani has begun to open out. His goal? To present a more acceptable face of Iran. But with regime hardliners still resolutely opposed to compromise, is Iran really opening up or just buying time?
Reporters on France 24 and France24.com.